Welcome to Toffs Toolers, a criminal Victorian venture, a weekly podcast digging deep into the worlds of the criminal and constabulary in the Victorian era. Your guides for this week's foray into our fascinating but somewhat brutal past are myself, Alex Hudson, a long-time enthusiast of Victorian crime and punishment, Mr. Hugh, a nautical troubadour of almost no renown. Will you sing a note for us, Mr. Hugh?
No.
Thank you. And Alex Sweetman, who made a Victorian gentleman sing into a top hat to get that voice. What did he get in exchange, Alex?
It was an impeccably styled moustache, but only for one day.
Makes sense. We're also helped by some random northerner that wandered into the office, Sean,
Hello.
and our distant, resident, microphone-shy script monkey, Duncan. This week's episode is all about baby farming, which confusingly does not involve tiny combine harvesters and ridiculously cute little onesies, but is a significantly darker and more disturbing chapter of our history that fortunately led to some well-needed reforms in policing and protecting children's welfare. And now knowing that it all gets better at the end when you think about baby farming, you could be happy that at the end of the podcast, you can go back to picturing toddlers in a worryingly cute combination of check shirts and dungarees, made oh so cute by the incongruous implication that a toddler may have to shoo a half-ton of cow away so they can get their combine harvester through the gate. Right, welcome to the show. Okay, gentlemen, this is going to be a difficult one, and I think it's only fair to actually warn people who may be of a more sensitive disposition. In all seriousness, we're going to be talking about things like infanticide, baby deaths, and obviously this is quite a sensitive subject for some people who may be listening. So I just want to put it out there, first of all, if you do feel like you're going to be affected by these particular issues, to please take care if you want to listen to this particular show. That being said, I think it's something that we have to talk about because it was such a difficult part of the Victorian experience. And it's something which gave rise to a lot of future legislation about how we look after children in our society now, never mind back then. So that being said, once we got that out of the way, I would like to invite you all to indulge in our front of show exercises. So first of all, for this particular show, I do believe I need to remind you all that there will be no Van Dyking during this particular show.
Oh, blimey.
Exactly. So there'll be none of that.
Roll your neck in, love.
Yeah. So there'll be no Van Dyking during this particular show. Neither shall we be talking about Jack the Ripper.
Who?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. And thirdly, as we already know, as introduced and explained by the inimitable Mr. Hugh, Dickens gets everywhere. He is multidimensional, he crosses timelines, and is available to every single Victorian at any point in time. And we will know this, and we will prove this over the coming shows and the coming weeks, by default, if not by actual fact, as we go through his inability to not be involved in everybody's lives in the Victorian era. It is really frustrating. Plus, he also is a bit of a Dickens. Back to the show. Baby farming. What is it?
I've got some ideas. Well, actually, I've got 3 ideas that immediately come to mind. First, you know when you get those tiny vegetables and you feel like a giant?
Oh, I love those tiny vegetables.
So baby farming, it's just farming like tiny broccoli, tiny carrots, tiny potatoes,
Tiny
right?
cabbages.
Yeah, tiny cabbages. No.
No.
I can tell by your face it's a no.
No.
Okay, second option.
This
You
is
take an infant and you put them
Oh.
in some dungarees and some wellies and you put them in the field and you have a baby who is farming, right?
you do literally have a baby who is farming.
Yeah.
Yes. It is not that.
Your face
no.
is still saying no. Okay. Third option, Cabbage Patch Kids.
No. No. Okay. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So there was a poor law introduced in 1834. Okay. So the poor law essentially took away care of orphaned infants away from the parish. So the parish church and the community itself would look after orphan children. This was considered to be a huge financial burden, possibly because of the expansion of cities and areas and more and more orphan children finding their way into this unfortunate
I
situation.
thought they went to a workhouse.
Well, they could go to a workhouse, yes, but that was alongside the introduction of the poor law itself, which made that particular space. What it did do is place the burden of the care of the child on the woman. So the poor law basically said the parish doesn't have to look after this child. You as the woman have to do it, not the father. There was an amendment later that said the father should make some sort of money, offer some sort of money as part of that. But obviously the stigma associated with having a child outside of wedlock meant that you had to be brave enough to stand up in court, point to a man, and then, what were they going to do? It said, no, that's no child of mine. And the magistrate said, fine, sounds good to me. Off you go, harlot. Go and look after your child.
Didn't have DNA tests back then.
No, nothing like that. And, women were still expected to work. They would have been doing 12-hour days. And even a crying child was considered to be a disease. Not the child, but the fact that they were crying. That was considered to be an illness. And that in itself was a stigma as well. So these women were left with very little option. So they were supposed to look after it. They didn't have the financial means necessarily. There was no recourse to provide money for that particular child. So what happened? They had to give it up for care. So there was a number of options. By the time they had the child, the lying in house was not an option. Lying in house was essentially a group of people you could go to who would take care of the child before it was born, in inverted commas, this being the age of euphemism.
Giving you a quiet birth.
Yeah, that was the unfortunate phrase. Yeah. After the lying in house, there were the procurers. These were intermediaries who might come to your house in a respectable fashion and offer a chance to adopt a child. They just happened to know people. And that would take away the child to a foster home. And that foster home, there was no regulation or anything like that. It was just literally, you pay this person a stipend.
You pay them.
Oh, you pay the foster home.
This is a service being provided.
Yeah. And then they would actually look after the child for a period. So there could be a large amount of money, like anything from £5 to £200, which obviously is quite a significant amount of money at that time. Or you'd pay them a weekly amount in order to look after that child. So the term baby farming is like a kind of media term, if you like, or a colloquial term for this process of children being moved into those sets of services.
And this was a permanent situation.
Yeah,
it wasn't like a nursery where they look after it for while you're at work and then you get the child back.
No, it wasn't like you didn't pawn your child. And sort of like, yeah, I'd like my child back now. Here's the ticket for my child. No, they would actually sort of surrender the child for somebody else's care, either for this one-time fee or for this like weekly amount. The problem started is the fact that there was no regulations until 1872, the Infant Life Protection Act. That came into there. So you've got a period of about 40 years, almost, where none of this was regulated. So anybody could look after these children and say that, yes, I'm a midwife or I'm a nurse or I'm a respectable adult.
I know someone who is looking to adopt. I can put you in touch.
Exactly, yes, for a small fee. And of course, the more babies you had, the more money you actually made. Hence, baby farming. So you brought more of these babies into care. And the sad fact is, the lack of regulation meant that more than one of these people who operated foster homes just allowed those children to waste away.
Between the stigma of the mother having a child out of wedlock, still needing to work and provide for the child being taken away, all of that, it just sounds like Les Miserables to me.
Yes,
Cosette being placed in the tavern.
Yeah, and it's kind of like this kind of, there is no good solution for a woman in this situation. If she happens to have a child and can't afford to look after it, or is in a station of life where she can't afford to have a child out of wedlock because her honour, her reputation will be completely ruined, you had to give your child away. And I can't imagine anything more appalling than having to give away and not really knowing whether or not it's going to a good home or not, because the procurer would obviously, you wouldn't have any interaction there. The procurer would take the child away, and then you hoped that child would be looked after.
But you still have to keep paying a weekly fee.
Yeah, unless it's like the one-off thing, yes.
And I suppose her honour, her reputation being taken away, that's not just her friends won't talk to her, but that's her employers no longer feel like they owe her anything.
Exactly.
She was in service, she was able to feed herself, and today she can't.
Yeah.
So the stakes couldn't be higher.
No, and it was something which never really sort of changed. So even when the Infant Life Protection Act came in, it didn't set up foster care. The state still avoided that kind of responsibility. And it wasn't until the early part of the 20th century that adoption homes and foster care and proper regulation came into effect. So how do you keep your child compliant and quiet and all the rest of it?
I've got some ideas.
Yes, but the Victorians had a very specific solution, and it was literally a solution. It was its mother's friend, or what was referred to as mother's friend. There are variations on that. Everybody knows about laudanum, or at least I hope you do. What's laudanum?
Familiar with it. It's a mix of alcohol and drugs.
Yeah, opium. Guess how much opium in your little ampule of
5%.
10.
10%.
10% opium. The rest alcohol in these little ampules. I can't remember the exact. It varied in sizes. They're quite small. So there was this fantastic word. We say chemist now. They used to refer to them as druggists, which I think is very apt.
It's very on the nose.
There was one druggist who reported to Parliament on how popular laudanum was when they were trying to regulate it later in the century. Never guess how much this guy in Northampton actually sold in a year.
Ooh, let's say 5 gallons.
That's pretty interesting guess. Any other advances?
I mean, how big were the ampules?
2 bathtubs.
They're quite small. So for those of you listening, I'm holding my fingers this far apart.
Maybe 50 pints.
50 pints. Any advance on 50 pints? A few gallons. It was 40 gallons in a year.
40 gallons.
Now, he was probably exceptional, but that's how much laudanum. That's what the Victorian public, and that was just laudanum. It wasn't these special solutions that were being sent out.
So that was the over-the-counter stuff.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. But you could order it through the papers. They had mail order for like how many pounds of opium, bales of opium you want actually sort of sent through the post.
I've heard of
it wasn't
fudge
that
by
bad,
post, but never opium by post.
No, it was. Basically, they used to advertise these mother's friends cordials. They didn't tell you what was in it, but it was great for teething. It will make your child quiet.
Sorry, this is for the children.
Oh,
not for the
adults,
mothers.
Adults could have it. Yeah, so you have your mum and your child. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, crying child was
a
disease.
Yeah.
That was something. And yeah, they would stop crying. You're raising heroin addicts, effectively, opioid addicts, but they wouldn't be crying. And then you could knock back the rest in the meantime.
It would certainly take the edge off.
Take the edge off after a 12-hour day, come home to a screaming baby. Here's your opium.
And here's mine.
Yes. One for you, one for the baby.
And I suppose you were talking about the neglect of these children. This is a huge part of it, the level of danger for those children, but also the baby farmer. Regardless of what intentions they started off with, if they're knocking back the laudanum, they're not likely to be motivated to look after these children that aren't even crying in distress.
No, it wasn't regulated, so you don't really know exactly what proportion of chemicals are actually in that. So you're giving it to your child, or to the child you're supposed to be looking after. I do wonder how many overdoses there were.
But this is also where economies of scale come in, because if you've taken, let's say, 5 children in, if 4 of them survive and most of them look about the same, then for all intents and purposes, everything's fine, right?
Yeah, because all the babies look like Winston Churchill.
Yes.
Even before Winston Churchill.
And given that it's called baby farming, like farming doesn't connotate small scale to me.
No, it was considered. I mean,
tens of.
It also
babies.
speaks to how the Victorians managed this whole situation in that they didn't want to acknowledge it at all, which is why the legislation appeared to be so slow. It was such a dark part of the history that they didn't even want to acknowledge that. They'd have to admit that orphan babies, even the clause that put the onus on women was called the bastardy clause. So women having these children were considered to be fallen women, and they were effectively ostracized. So they didn't even want to admit that could happen. Never mind the fact that there were all these orphan children wandering around.
But in terms of black markets, there was a need for the services being provided by these farmers.
Clearly.
So the advertising, it must have been plain as day in the papers, just using
it's like
friendly
adoption.
phrases.
Yeah, it's like we know somebody in the countryside who'd love to have a child and this sort of thing. But I tell you what, this is quite a difficult subject. We will come back to some of the perpetrators of it, but I do feel like we need a bit of a palate cleanser. Yes. So I dread to ask, Sean, but what job are you doing this week?
Leeches.
Excellent. Okay. I had to ask. So we'll be talking about leeches next. Any clue on what the Dickens is this week?
Oh, I think we've got another author for you.
Excellent. Okay, that's going to sound exciting. All right, we'll come back with that in a second. Bit of a palate cleanser, like I said, and then we'll come back to baby farming and some of the perpetrators of those crimes later. Is your tooth pain making soup a dangerous game? Is your eating joy reduced by the torment produced? Do you wish your cocoa, coffee and tea could once again be pain-free? Here at Fraser's Barbers, we remove your gnarly gnashes quickly and fuss-free. Your mouth may be brown, but we won't let you down. A quick shot, a little tug and you're on your way. Don't give the quacks the satisfaction. We'll remove all mouthy putrefaction. Stop that painful bite. Come to Fraser's tonight. 47A Whitechapel Road. And welcome back. As promised, we're going to take a slight break from what is quite a difficult, complex subject. And we are going, of course, to Mr. Hugh and to Sean for this week's What the Dickens. I'm quite excited for that. And slightly less excited to know what you've been up to with leeches, Sean. But we will come back to that. And of course, What the Dickens is named in honour of the fact that Dickens was not only prolific, but also a bit of a Dickens in his own right. So who do you have for us this particular week, Mr. Hugh?
Well, today, another literary connection. I have Algernon Charles Swinburne, our Dickens of the week. The fleshy poet and something of a contrast to our last Dickens of the week. Swinburne, a guest very difficult to get rid of. But let's start with his connection to Dickens. So, as a young lad, whilst Dickens was writing David Copperfield, he holidayed close to the Swinburnes and was so taken with the 12-year-old Swinburne that he was written into the story as just a bit part. But they remained friends for life. Swinburne absolutely worshipped Dickens. He could recite his stories at length from memory, read them almost every day. And Dickens, in return, defended the younger Swinburne's reputation when he emerged into the poetic world with a rather scandalous breakthrough work, Atalanta in Claydon. Swinburne was a brilliant poet, but as a guest, he was a walking hurricane. He was a tiny man with an enormous head of flaming red hair, possessing of an energy that no Victorian dinner party could contend with. He would arrive and would perform. He would not just sit and chat, but leap around the room like a bird, flapping his hands in a nervous tick, reciting his own poetry, screaming his own poetry at the top of his lungs. He officially limited himself to a single drink. I don't think this was ever observed in practice. Not out of discipline, but he knew, as did everyone who met him in society, that after a single glass of wine, he would be either up on the table reciting his poetry or screaming out Greek tragedies, or under the table incoherent. There really was no other gear for him. This almost destroyed his position in society, but he had many dear friends, including Theodore Watts Dunton, who almost kidnapped our dear Algernon. For the final 30 years of his life, a single visit to Theodore's house turned into a 30-year residency where he was put in a strict regime of a mere pint of beer a day. And if you knew anything about Victorian water, a pint of beer was practically the safe minimum of alcohol you could drink without coming down with something appalling. So he went from being a flamboyant, ridiculous, and utterly exhausting dinner guest to rattling around the countryside in someone else's abode for the last 30 years of his life. It was said that the poet had died, but the man had been saved by this.
It sounds like he was the embodiment of go big or go home.
Quite. And his own home was too small to contain him. He needed someone else to act almost as his jailer.
So he basically sort of gave up his freedom for a pint of beer a day. So that's kind of...
And was this voluntary?
Insanity. It was, yes, to the extent that Victorian care was such.
I quite like the idea of having a pet poet.
Yeah.
I think it'd be quite good.
How much of a friend would you have to be to run that kind of intervention? Because it had to be an intervention, didn't it?
Was
I mean,
just
it was
that.
you've had a really good time. We're just going to we're going to take you away for the next 30 years and
Yes.
we'll just tell everyone
In
you
fact,
died.
you've had such a good time, you've used up your quota for this
For this life,
incarnation,
yes. Anyway, nice poetry. Thanks very much. So anyway, speaking of interventions, Sean, I dread to ask, but you did just say leeches
Yes,
at one particular
leeches.
point. So it was rats previously and
Still
now...
on the animal theme, yes.
Okay, all right. So what's with the leeches?
So, leeches, potentially a lucrative field. Not done in a field, done in a swamp, a little bit cold.
Right.
Basically, what you do is you find a nice leechy bog or swamp, usually in the north of the country. They like the colder climate, and you defrock, take off your trousers, walk into this swamp, and just wait for a while. It's quite easy work.
That sounds pretty straightforward. Yeah.
No drawback then.
Some drawback. And what happens is the leeches will find your nice warm body and be attracted by your blood and literally leech onto you. And then you walk out and you wait. You can't take the leeches off your body straight away because their teeth apparently will stay in you. So you have to wait until they finish feeding. And then they just fall off and you put them in a jar and then you sell them. Now, some people...
Who do you sell them to?
I'll get onto that. But some people who may be a little bit wealthier, who have old farm animals like horses that are a bit too old to work in the fields or pull the carriages, they'll take their old horses, they'll drive them into the swamp. The leeches will grab onto those, and then when they come out, they just swipe more. I imagine they collect quite a few more than I was able to.
Oh, you're going to say you don't have a pony?
I don't have... no.
Okay.
Unfortunately not.
No, you didn't catch any rats.
I didn't catch any rats,
Oh,
no.
you could have dunked them into the swamp
No, but...
with a convenient tail.
Indeed. So this craze all came about... It's been ongoing for a while, but was really popularised by this Frenchman, this Dr. Francois Joseph Victor Brousset, I believe his name is.
So many names. Must be good.
Indeed.
Must be French.
It's a very memorable name.
Yes. And his famous doctor, his claim was that all maladies are caused by an imbalance in the humours of the body. You have blood, phlegm, bile, etc.
All the phlegms and biles, yeah.
Indeed.
Biles both yellow and black.
Indeed. And he believed that by balancing these humours, predominantly by reducing the amount of blood in the body through leaching, and he said it could cure anything from a headache to cancer.
That seems reasonable. So you should be
indeed.
healthy now, like really healthy.
You do look quite pale.
Well, I don't think I believe him too much because I've had thousands of these buggers leaching out of me and I feel worse than ever.
Okay. So I guess what this is building up to tell us that you're not going to continue with the leech collecting
I am not.
industry. Okay. Despite the fact that it could be quite profitable. All right. So no rat catching, no leech collection. I hope you find another job that will...
I did manage to sell some leeches
Yeah?
to our friendly landlord, Varney.
Really?
But for
What
some
does he need
reason,
them
he
for?
wanted the fresh plump ones.
Oh, he's so weird. That's why he stuck us in the back room. Okay, we wish you well and a speedy recovery from whatever illness you contracted this week,
you.
because I'm assuming that there were some. And thank you as well, Mr. Hugh, for another innovating Mr. What the Dickens. Yeah, we look forward to whatever Dickens comes around the corner next week. We're going to take a small break right now. When we come back, we'll get to the matter at hand. Is your posture poor? Is your vitality lacking? Do you wake each morning feeling faint, listless, or insufficiently charged? Then perhaps what your body needs is electricity. Introducing Dr. Scott's electrified corset for ladies and the belt for discerning gentlemen. It is the very latest in scientific undergarments. Woven with copper threads, reinforced with steel, and fitted with a discreet galvanic cell, this modern marvel restores nervous energy, strengthens the spine, and stimulates the feminine constitution. all while remaining perfectly respectable beneath your gown.
My wife no longer swoons without reason. When she does so with excellent posture.
Simply wear, perspire, and allow nature and science to do the rest. Dr. Scott's electric corset. If it tingles, it's working. If it sizzles, don't disengage. Your ribs secured in an electric cage. And burn marks, dear madam, are all the rage. Available now from all reputable chemists and several disreputable ones. Welcome back to the show. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for your little interludes. I really hope you find something that actually sticks next time. Well, not literally sticks,
Yeah.
but, you know, that a job you enjoy, let's say.
I've got to be good at something, right?
let's,
One day,
let's hope,
one day.
hopefully, yes. Oh, touch wood. Anyway, I know it's going to come. I know we had a little interlude. That was something that we definitely needed, but we do have to finish up talking about some of the cases, the specific cases around baby farming. So shall I? It's quite dark, some of this. I wanted to talk about two specific individuals myself. I think we'll finish with Amelia last because she was so instrumental in defining what this crime was. But I will mention another lady who was convicted because her case is a little bit unusual. Margaret Waters in 1870. Now, Margaret was quite interesting in that she seemed to want to genuinely look after these children to begin with. She started her career by bringing children in and looking after them, and she gained her reputation for doing that. But for some reason, over the years that followed, up until her arrest in 1870, that slided, and she actually left children in the care of other children, rather than looking after themselves. She used to go down to the gin palace and all the rest of it to spend the money she got from baby farming. So it's an example of how even the women who were in this situation were overtaken by their own circumstances and were unable to look after the children. So it just became this self-fulfilling prophecy. That doesn't obviate her crimes, because what happened to the children in her care were pretty gross. They ended up being malnourished, they died of starvation, and the specific case that led to her arrest was pretty gruesome in itself. The baby in question that certain authorities were alerted to was actually the product of a rape. A 16-year-old girl was raped, and the child, well, they were both children. It was a child having a child. She was forced to give up the baby by her father, who found Margaret Waters through an advert in the paper, and the baby was passed on to Margaret Waters, who then subsequently simply pretty much left it to die. Now, the police, when they raided Margaret Waters' house, managed to rescue the child, but it was so malnourished it died a few weeks later. And that is the tragedy of the situation, that a young girl who was forced into this situation, her own father made her give up that child so that it could be passed to somebody else, and then eventually it died. It's just tragedy compounding tragedy. I mean, Waters faced death penalty for this as a result, which is understandable in that particular time. But obviously you have a situation where somebody actually wanted to start out by doing good and then fell into harder times as time went on, and clearly didn't have the wherewithal to do anything else at that point.
It's crazy to think that, like, you start out with a relatively stable structure, and I wonder whether it started off with like one time where she was like, "You're an older child, can you look after this one?" And it went well. And then she started to rely on it, and before you know it, it's now the way things are done, and then things start falling through the cracks and it all falls apart.
Just thinking, well, if they can look after each other, I'm just going to go for a drink.
Or if it just became mother's friend was a lot more mother's friend and down the gym palace over time because it all gets too much.
I think there's certainly absolute neglect involved, because it wasn't that one child. That's just the example that led to her arrest.
Yeah.
And the other child died in a care, and there was certainly some sort of concern about Margaret's history involved in this. But yeah, there was a definite slide from one point. So that was 1870, though. So this was before a lot of the Infant Life Protection Act and so forth came
Yeah,
in.
in 1872.
Yeah, so you've been looking at that as well,
I
haven't
do.
you?
I'm going to have to
Oh,
refer
it's
to
all
my
flashcards.
my flashcards again, but I've got a specific case of Jessie King. Now, She was tried in 1889, so quite a bit after the Act, but her case showed how ineffectual the Act was as a whole, because the Infant Life Protection Act didn't have any powers of observation or investigation associated with it. So all the stuff that it claimed, like we're going to protect this, we're going to do this, look after the welfare of children, there was no powers to actually go into properties until someone had found out something. So there was no powers of investigation or observation initially. So with Jessie, she was the last woman to be hanged in Edinburgh, which is
Oh.
an interesting fact in itself. But her crime was discovered entirely by accident. This is after 2 decades. 2 decades after the Infant Life Protection Act was in place, she was finally caught. And it was because of a couple of young boys who were playing football nearby her residence, and they found a parcel which contained the remains of an infant.
Oh.
And that then led to a bit of an investigation. She was living with her partner at the time, Thomas Pearson. The police originally thought that he was involved. He ended up giving evidence against her that secured her conviction. And yeah, it's horrible to think that 1872 all the way through to 1889, she had a free reign because no one was going to look any closer. I dread to think about what Thomas Pearson was actually doing in the house to have not noticed the level of abuse that she had.
It
Because
seems unlikely, doesn't
there
it?
were many, many children involved.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
did these acts not require some sort of license for, the people who are going to accept the babies, or was it just,
After 1872,
Given
yeah, they were supposed to
guidance.
be regulated to a certain degree, but it was like almost like a voluntary kind of process. It's not until much later legislation, in fact, after Amelia Dyer, who I'll talk about next, who actually started to see much more robust legislation. So, shall we end with Amelia Dyer?
I think we have to.
Okay, so this lady is somebody who has been touted as one of Britain's greatest serial killers, was a baby farmer, and has been attributed with the deaths of around 200 to 400 children in her
quite a
care
range?
over a series of decades. And like your Jessie, she was doing this for decades. She didn't go to trial until about 1895, 1896. And she was involved in baby farming for many, many years. What led the authorities to there was a particularly gruesome. She was known as like the butcher of Reading, and so forth, because the level of deaths that were actually associated with her, and the way that she was discovered was also like almost accidental. It was the corpse of a baby in the river, floating downstream, which was fished out, and it had been strangled using some white tape used for edging in tailoring.
And it was just chance that someone...
And somebody put 2 and 2 together. It led to Amelia, who it was clear that she had had a lot of suspicion associated with her activities for quite some time. And the police actually surveilled the house to actually sort of see who was coming and going, whether she was involved in this activity. And they eventually raided it, and they found pretty much a horrific state of affairs. She was actually arrested for, or was charged with the deaths of 6 children who were all murdered the same way. And she actually said in court transcripts, "You'll know mine by the tape around their neck."
Oh, that's chilling.
It is really cold. So the actual number of deaths attributed to her is potentially taken from the life of her baby farming activities over a series of any number of years, but we don't know exactly how many she would have been responsible for. All the accounts seem to imply that she was cold, diffident, and uncaring about the harm that she caused over many, many years. And she spoke in these very chilling ways about how she'd actually murdered them, because she used to starve them to death, then moved to strangulation as a means of quicker. And oddly, during the case, the founder of the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the NSPCC, a gentleman called, I think it's Reverend Benjamin Waugh, he said she was the most saintly of all the baby farmers.
That's kind of at odds with what you've
Yes.
told us so far.
I know it seems odd that his rationale was he was basically saying she gave them 6 seconds of pain, whereas most baby farmers gave them 6 weeks by forcibly starving.
That's right.
So that's kind of, yeah, this gives you an idea. And of course, this case was had national attention at the time. You don't hear her talked about except in context, and there's very very few modern equivalents that you can actually find. I was trying to think about who might have taken people into care. So the only British serial killer I could think of in recent times would be someone like Harold Shipman. For those of you who don't know, he was a GP in the UK. He, at the other end of the age scale, used to look after elderly patients and effectively euthanize them. Sometimes after changing their wills and so forth, and he's potentially responsible for hundreds of deaths.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly. So that's the only person I could think of that comes even close in British history to what Amelia actually apparently did. And it's
But you
just
said 200 to 400 for Amelia.
200 to 400
Did she
deaths.
brag about that number? She's
No,
only
I don't think
charged
so.
up
This
to
is
6.
this is something that everybody's reported on, especially from the court cases, but there's no specific evidence for that number. She was only charged with 6 deaths, and that was enough to get her executed. But yeah, she didn't appear to have a huge amount of remorse at all. She basically said, God, I'll answer to God, not to you people down here.
You mentioned that the police surveilled the property. That was pretty unusual at the time, wasn't it?
It doesn't get mentioned much, but I think this case was so unusual. You don't get a little insight into these kind of policing practices. But yeah, they actually set up a series of watches, like undercover officers and so forth, so they could actually sort of provide evidence that this baby farming activity was actually going on and give them the pretext for raiding that particular house at this time. So yeah, the only good thing to come out of this, you could actually say to come out of this, was change in legislation, which eventually led to UK laws, which would actually provide state care, properly regulated state care for foster children. It didn't change a lot of the prevailing attitudes towards women and, birth out of wedlock or anything like that. But at least you knew that those foster homes where forcible deaths might have happened were starting to get rarer and rarer and more tightly regulated.
Yeah, and with a state-run foster care system or state-backed foster care system, you know that there's going to be at least this standard of care for the children.
And some regulation, yeah. I know we'll get people writing in and say, well, there are all these cases of state-run facilities which have done appalling things, but at least you're actually moving in the right direction at that particular point.
But
It's
even
just
something like child benefit, which is, it's a great thing to help children have the stuff that they need, but you do still see nowadays that being misappropriated by some parents.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we can talk about how criminal activity used to exploit children and neglect. The fact that we still have laws to cope with neglect and abuse of children is unfortunately an indication that it still happens. It just luckily doesn't seem to be happening on the kind of scale that happened in the Victorian era. So that is a kind of positive I'd like to end on today, because it's been a difficult and dark subject. But it's one, if we were talking about Victorian crime, we couldn't possibly avoid. So thank you, gentlemen, for taking us through this quite difficult subject. And I promise we'll get on to something perhaps a little bit lighter next week when we Voca Romani, which I'm particularly looking forward to. And we'll explain more next week. Toffs Toolers, a criminal Victorian adventure, was brought to you by Dreadful Penny Productions. The cast were Mr. Alexander Hudson, Alexander Sweetman Esquire, Sean Gibson, and Mr. Hugh. The scripts were inked by Duncan Allwood, with constant interjections from the cast. The producers were Bella Gregory and Rob Morris. Production facilities were provided by the fine fellows of the Podcast Room, London. This show was first broadcast by Telegraph in 1844 by Mr. Sweetman, where he cautioned all with "What hath God wrought?" before sending. He felt it fair to provide a warning.